Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending upon where you are in the world. I wanted to welcome you back to the course on initiation into Spiritism. I am Kirsten DeMelo. Today, I will be your host, and I will be covering lesson 16, or otherwise known as chapter 19, entitled Blessed Are Those Who Mourn, in the beautiful book by Teresina Oliveira, Initiation to Spiritism. If you don't already have the book, we highly recommend you go out, you read it, you buy it first, obviously, and you read it and you do your own study, and don't just do it late at night where you're almost half asleep and you're dozing off, but really make some time for it. It will enrich your soul. So let's get to it. Today we're discussing chapter 19, Blessed are those who mourn. And that phrase in and of itself, you may be familiar with. You may say, I think I've heard something like that before. And you would be right if you are familiar with the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes or from the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus gave, blessed are those who mourn, and many other Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, so forth and so on. There's a good deal. If you haven't read those, highly recommend that as well, to go ahead and do your research on that as well. Simply beautiful. What's really interesting is the definition of beatitudes. Now, beatitudes, like the original definition and meaning, what it's supposed to mean is this deep sense of joy and jubilation. And when you think about the phrase, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted, the feeling of, intense and immense happiness seems like an oxymoron. But we believe, and this is our own personal hypothesis about this, that because based off of some of the teachings that we've learned in the books by the spirit Manuel Filomeno de Miranda, by the medium Givaldo Franco, the Brazilian Spiritist medium, he has a good number of books that are already in English. Again, that's Manuel Filomeno de Miranda. And he has various different books, but in some of the books he talks about, and forgive us, we don't remember the specific book offhand, but he talks about that on earth, at the time that we're living right now, there are emotions, good emotions, that we have yet to feel. So, if we already know that in our limited capacity to experience the feeling of love is rudimentary at its best. And the name just came back to me, and it's in the book Planetary Transition. So that emotion, these higher level emotions, they tell us in that book that on other planets, there are these high level good emotions that we have yet to even perceive or have a notion of. We might have a little inkling what that could be. So for us, we hypothesize that when Jesus talked about the Beatitudes and named it as such, blessed are those who mourn, for they should be comforted. They talk about a type of comfort and love and fulfillment we don't fully grasp on this earth yet. Because for us, when we suffer, even the consequent comfort we may receive after it isn't necessarily what we consider happiness and joy. But indeed, a hypothesis that we have formed that it is a rudimentary feeling that on a higher plane or on a higher planet that's more evolved than ours, when we reach a higher level of our evolution, we will be able to experience that deep level of fulfillment, of purpose and meaning in our lives. And if you who are listening have ever experienced a truly deep anguish and pain in your life, and you've come through it, and you're able to learn from it, then you too, I'm sure, will be able to say that it's changed your perspective. It might have grounded you and given you a broader perspective on the meaning of life and purpose. And when you think about the person you were before that, when you compare, most times, if not every time, you're a different person, but for the better. Perhaps more vulnerable, perhaps more open, and it almost as if it seems like you're in uncharted territory as to who I am now after this experience. But we believe that blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted, is an invitation for us on how to manage our pain, our struggles, our vicissitudes. And even in the Greek language, the word mourn really is emphasized as a word to be a very strong word, meaning having to deal with the death of someone that we love. But it also can be applied to um, symbolically in our lives. Whether we lose a friend because we parted ways, or we part ways with a partner in our lives, or we do indeed lose a loved one because they pass on to the spirit realm. But there are many types of loss we can experience. Loss of the ideal life we thought we were going to have, and the life that we now have and have to learn how to accept and embrace. So all of this is a teaching for us on how to deal with the struggles in our lives. And truly, if you have gone through a hardship, you know what I'm talking about. You know the sensation that when you give it to God, when we are able to accept it, not acceptance like I'm throwing my hands up, that's it, I give up, I'm not doing anything. It's not that. It's accepting that there is a higher learning that needs to be had here. That God, in his infinite wisdom, is allowing me to endure this for a purpose I may not understand, and allow me to briefly share with you a true story that happened in the 19th century with a man by the name of Horatio Stafford. You probably haven't heard of him. It's highly unlikely, but he did write a very famous hymnal that a lot of churches, especially older churches, even till today, they still utilize this famous hymnal or hymn that he wrote called "It Is Well With My Soul." And for those of you who may not be familiar, you can Google the actual words to the song. But let me give you a little bit of a backstory first. So this particular hymn is sung in churches and spiritual gatherings because it's a very uplifting song about connecting with God. And I'll read you just briefly a small excerpt from the first line of the song. And Horatio, Mr. Stafford rather, he wrote the following lines: "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to know it is well, it is well with my soul." There's a little bit more to the song, but this is the first part of it, and it's so powerful. We want to share you his brief story, which actually isn't too brief, but we're sharing a small excerpt of his life. Who was Horatio Stafford? In the 19th century, he lived in New York. He was a very, very accomplished lawyer at his time. He started his own law firm, and he became a senior partner and made tons and tons of money that he actually took that money and invested it in the 19th century and invested it in housing and property. He put all of his family's fortune, everything he'd ever earned, into that. And also, he had gotten married. He had 5 children, and he was a devout Christian. Him and his wife had raised their children that way. So fast forward a few years after he purchased a lot of land in Chicago, and in the late 1800s, there was the famous Chicago fires that burned for 3 days. And in those 3 days of burning, a lot of houses were lost and lives were lost. Fortunately, Mr. Stafford did not lose any family members, but he did lose all of his family's fortune in that fire because all the houses that he had purchased all burned, along with hundreds of others. So that was a huge devastation for him and his family, but he didn't waver. He didn't give up. Him and his wife maintained their faith. I said, okay, well, I'm going to roll up my sleeves, begin again. And soon within it, he did recoup his fortune. But alongside that, one of the other things that happened to him right around this time was that his beloved young son, who was probably about 2 years old at that time, had actually passed away from pneumonia. So that also, you would think, well, here's a man that lost his whole fortune. And then on top of, to add insult to injury, as they say, his youngest child, his only son, passed away. But even still, with all of that, they persevered. They continued. So soon after, when he gained his fortune back, and he told his wife that they wanted to take a family trip to Britain, and they had scheduled everything. And at that time, you went by ship. They weren't doing the airplanes yet, guys. So they were making these long trips over these big, illustrious ships. So him and his wife and his 4 daughters were all set to go, but at the last minute, something happened with his work. He had to stay behind in Chicago. His wife and 4 children, they went off to Britain, and he was going to meet them later. But what ended up happening is that on their way, the ship on the way there, on one particular late evening, the ship had crashed into another ship. And within approximately 12 minutes, they estimated the entire ship had sunk, taking with it a lot of lives, including Mr. Stafford's 4 young daughters and wife. This was enough to put any person completely off kilter, to throw you off, to completely question so many things. But as this had happened, the next day, there was a man out on a boat near that same area where the wreckage had happened. And he just happened upon the wreckage, and he saw a woman lying unconscious on part of the wreckage from the boat. He grabbed her, he brought her onto his boat, he brought her to shore. Come to find out that that woman was Mrs. Stafford, Horatio's wife. She actually ended up living, but her 4 daughters did not. So she gets back on land. She messages her husband through telegram, and he quickly leaves Chicago and meets her where she's at. And they come together, and you would think at this point they fell apart. You would think at this point they give up. You would think at this point that this would tear them apart, but quite the opposite. It's even said, there are accounts that when the ship was going down, Mrs. Stafford got on her knees with her kids quickly, obviously, and prayed out loud and saying, God, if this is your will, let it be done. But if you can save my children and I, please, I beg of you. But if not, let your will be done. Because there were some survivors from that ship, very few, 20 or less, some crew and others. And it is said that she has been documented having said that. So we just see in those difficult times her true belief, her faith, as well as the faith of her husband. So here they come back together, and although they've recouped their wealth, Mr. Stafford has recouped their wealth, but now all 5 children have gone. So what happens shortly thereafter? Mrs. Stafford ends up having 3 more children, 2 girls and 1 boy. And let me digress and go back. Right after the death of his 4 daughters and almost his wife, he actually, on his way back to meet his wife, right in the area where the two ships had crashed. The captain of the ship that the husband was on to meet his wife had said, "Listen, Mr. Safford, this is the area where the collision happened with the ship, and this is where the ship went down." So there actually is a letter that he had wrote to a family member right during that time, explaining how he feels. And through that experience, he wrote this song, "It Is Well With My Soul," in commemoration and in memory of his daughters. And it was a testament to his faith, because he knew that whatever God was allowing him to experience, it was for a purpose. It was for a reason. And he still had faith. He still had faith and believed as much as he'd ever believed. And believe it or not, if you think about what it must have been like for him on so many levels, but what it must have been like for him and his wife to experience that loss, that pain. They lost their son, then they lost their 4 children in a very tragic way, very unexpected. How painful that was. But out of that came this beautiful poem to God, and it's a conversation. And when you read that first paragraph, this first couple sentences from that song, "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to know it is well with my soul." It's a sense of peace that he connected with the Father. We're sharing all this to illustrate and to talk about this chapter. This particular chapter, chapter 19, it goes into the causes, the current causes of our pains, of the difficulties we experience. They can be from this life, but chances are, more than likely, they're from a previous life. And we're carrying on and experiencing hardships that we may not understand. And Mrs. Stafford actually was quoted at one point, it may have been by a newspaper or an interview, just saying that she truly believed that if God took her children away from her, that God had a reason. And one day she'll find out what that reason is. And until then, she accepts his will. A very powerful message of faith, of the choices we have. And here you have a family that went through something extremely tragic. We don't know why. They didn't know why. And that what could explain why they lost their fortune, they lost all their children. And yet at the end of their lives, something to note that's very interesting, with their 3 children, later in life, they moved to Jerusalem, and they opened it's called the American Academy Hotel. It basically served to help those who were, it was a charitable work that they assisted anyone, regardless of, race, creed, gender, or religious affiliation. They were there to support those who are in need there in Israel. And it was a huge organization that existed and that they had started. So they lived out the rest of their life serving and always preaching and living the gospel. So when we think about this, we don't have explanations often when we're going through hardships. But let us take solace in knowing that there is an explanation. It's out there that one day we will come to. But right now we have something which in this chapter they talk about, which is forgetfulness of the past. And it is providential. It's the wisdom of God for us to forget, because it's very possible that should we even remember, that it would cause us a great deal of more pain, knowing what we might have done in a distant past to cause our circumstances today. Because more times than not, what we are reaping today is probably from a lifetime that we are very far removed from. And today, at the evolved state that we've reached, we're ready to learn the lessons that we need to learn. So it is a blessing to have forgetfulness of the past. Although we can see, we can look at our tendencies, our vain or inclinations that we have, to kind of get a glimpse into who or what we may have been in the past. But let us not get fixated on that. Let us not focus on, well, who was I in the past? What did I do? Was I somebody famous? Sometimes people get very caught up in those things. It's not important, because when we go to the spirit realm, if we were the Queen of England, we would still be treated as any other child of God. Before God, before his kingdom, before the good spirits, we are equal. But also something else to remember, and Teresia Oliveira brings to us in this chapter, that our forgetfulness is not 100%. It's not complete. And we are able at times, depending upon our state of mind, our level of evolution, our morality, are able to get a glimpse into what has happened to us in the past, whether that's through dreams or whether through mediumistic experiences, through deep, profound meditation or hypnosis or otherwise. Some people can have some flashbacks or strong memory recalling what has happened to them in the past, because we know that we have this huge hard drive that is our subconscious, where we store all of that data from so many lifetimes. It's there. But right now it's probably in in multiple zip files, stored away in a location that we are not to access. But there are times in our lives that something may trigger it, something may bring it about, a memory. And one of the interesting things that Joanna de Angelis, the spirit guide of the prolific Brazilian spiritist medium Givaldo Franco, has shared in many of her books, is that although we forget the past, what we never lose is our emotional memory. That's why there are people that sometimes feel when they meet someone, they don't like them right off the bat. Or they meet someone and they just love them so much. They feel an immediate connection, and it's just like something is just there. And we're not talking about necessarily in a romantic sense, but when you meet someone, it's like you just know that's your best friend. You just connect with them. Usually that's because you've had previous lifetimes with them. They are part of your spiritual family. Now, sometimes there is that aspect or that factor of lack of affinity. It's not that that person has wronged you, it's just that you're just on very different vibrational levels. And that's okay. We're all different. We're all on our own level. We're all just trying to make it out here. That's okay. This is not for us to judge or anything like that. Spiritism is never here to educate us, to judge others. It's merely to educate ourselves and to love ourselves and to love others as well. One of the other things is that when we talk about this particular chapter and how we deal with our struggles, and one of the things not only in this chapter, but also hopefully you have gained from this story that we shared on Horatio Stafford, is that the best way to deal with our struggles is to soften and to not harden. Oftentimes when we go through struggles, we become hard and cold and bitter and angry. We become angry at God or whomever, a creator or just the world. But instead of being overwhelmed by this sense of wanting to protect our pride, if we could simply, but it's not so simple, but if we could be open to the idea of leaning into that which is difficult, leaning into the emotion, our experience of fear, leaning into it, being able to lean into that fear, lean into that struggle. Because when we get angry, when we rebel, when we harden, we're pulling away, we're pushing away the experience. But really, the experience is there to help us to grow. So instead of moving away, lean in, face it, see what it's there to teach you. Oftentimes, these things are not as scary once you face them. They're not as scary as what they seem. And all these things, if we're able to have a broader understanding of life, instead of being materialistic, this is what can truly assist us with dealing with all sorts of struggles in our life. Because when we have the hope and the understanding that these experiences are just temporary, that we can and will experience happiness, joy, love, all the good emotions. But sometimes part of the journey is also allowing ourselves to feel what we feel and show ourselves compassion and be okay with that, but learn and keep growing and keep moving. Not just acknowledging, well, I'm angry, and then just staying in your anger, staying in your rebelliousness. We can acknowledge that part of us, that it's there, and ask that part of us what it's there to teach us. What can we learn from it? This is a part of getting to know ourselves. This is the part where we actually have to do the work. We actually have to roll up our proverbial sleeves and sit with ourselves. We are our own greatest obstacle. We get in our own way to our own happiness. We often can blame the spirits, obsessors, my upbringing, or this or that, and perhaps all those things play a role. But ultimately, it's me, my decision to change my perspective, to be open to look at things from a different perspective, to know how to suffer well with faith and love, accepting that the consequences that have happened before, that whatever has happened in the past, my past lives, 20, 30, 50 lifetimes ago, and just like be accepting, that this is my situation. I know it's temporary. I'm going to see my loved ones again, just as Mr. Stafford knew and believed that one day he would see his children again. He believed in the afterlife. He believed that he will be with God again one day. So they had that hope, and that allowed them to endure their hardships, to endure all those difficult moments. And we are not unlike Mr. Stafford and his wife. So many of us suffer. So many of us go through situations that bring us to our knees, quite literally sometimes. But part of this life, part of this experience is learning how to deal with pain. Learning how to, quote unquote, suffer well, suffer wisely. It sounds like a paradox. And it is in a way. How do you suffer wisely? Look at the lesson. There is a lesson, I promise you. And we promise you that it's not forever. That the pain you experience, although your mind and brain and heart may all be telling you, and you may completely be feeling this 100%, that there's no way you can ever be happy again. You will be. Lean on our faith, on your faith. Lean on God. Lean on hope. And lean into the experience. It's kind of like when you get into a car and you don't want to keep your eyes open. So you close your eyes the entire ride from point A to point B. But when we ask and suggest for you to lean into the experience, it means to open your eyes. Have no fear. We are immortal souls. We are put here to learn and to grow. So let's see what's out there. Let's see what is there to learn. And quite honestly, there is so much for us to learn, so much joy to be had still in our lives. And so one of the take-home messages today that Terezinha Oliveira shares in this book, it's shared throughout the codification. It's shared throughout the books of Joanna DeAngelis. She has a great psychological series of books that help us to improve our mind, our perspective, the way we handle things, our emotions. But one of the ways we can get out of the rut, get out of our negative vibes, get out of all those negative mental illnesses is seeking to improve ourselves. And we're not just talking about physically. We know that a healthy diet is important. We know that proper exercise is really good for the body. We're talking about changing morally and emotionally for the better. Constantly working on ourselves. And what will that look like? For each one of us, it'll be different. But that might look like enriching your mind by reading an uplifting book every day, making it a habit to nourish your mind daily with something positive, maybe in the morning and at night, maybe midday, and being more intentional throughout the day, throughout your week. That what you listen to, what you watch on Netflix or Hulu or Prime Video or HBO Max or Disney Plus or Paramount or all the other streaming services that most people have nowadays, be mindful what you're watching. We know that there are so many exciting movies to be watched out there, but we encourage you to not forget to connect with all the good and inspiring films, documentaries, and movies that are out there, because we are spiritual beings having this human experience. And we are here to grow. We are here to love. We are here to enrich ourselves. And don't be afraid, because blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. We will go through hardships, but we also are promised that soothing balm if we're ready to take that leap of faith, of hope, to connect with the Creator, probably needing to reorganize our lives and look at the meaning and purpose of it all for us, the higher purpose in it all. And that, dear friends, will help us to find the hope and the solace and the peace that each one of us may so desperately want to find. So, dear friends, this is the part where I end and I say thank you for watching. I believe this time we might have some questions, and hopefully my voice doesn't give out and I can still be here. But let's go ahead and answer some questions. Our first question that was sent to us is the following. And the question is asked, is it wrong for someone to feel happy knowing that the person who has wronged them will get their payback, if not in this life, then in another? That's a $1 million question. So there are a couple of aspects to that question I wanted to answer. Is it wrong for someone to feel happy knowing that the person who has wronged them will get their payback? First, let's acknowledge there are no wrong or right emotions per se. We are what we are experiencing. And the more and the harsher we are in ourselves and in others, just perpetuates the problem. But what we need to do is accept and acknowledge and accept what we're feeling, why we're feeling the way that we're feeling. Because in this question that this person asked, behind it probably is a person who still has not yet forgiven, who still holds that poison of anger within themselves. And maybe they need to do some inner reflections. And we don't say this in a negative sense. It's not about being wrong or right, because the reality is, when I commit a wrong, I don't commit it against another human being or another soul or spirit. I commit it against the laws of God. And they talk about that in the book Action and Reaction by the spirit André Louise, by the medium Chico Xavier. And people often feel like, well, when someone wrongs me, they're wronging me. And it's a misconception. People are not wronging us. We get hurt. We can get traumatized and devastated and feel all types of emotions, and they're all valid. But when I transgress or commit a transgression, it is against the laws of God, which means that, yes, one day that person is going to have to answer for that. Rest assured, each one of us will evolve. Each one of us will move on to learn the lessons that we need to learn. But we need to pay attention to our own selves. We need to pay attention to how we feel and not being preoccupied with others. And the reason we say that is because if we allow or place our happiness in someone else's basket, we give them the power. But what you want to do is take back that power and say, no, I want to take back my happiness. I want to take back my power to find joy and happiness. So, friends, I hope I answered that question. I think we might have another question as well coming up. So we forget our past lives while in the physical body, but when I die, will I spontaneously remember everything when I reach the spirit realm? This is not a black and white question. It's a yes and a no. It's a yes because we can even remember parts of our lives even when we're still here in the physical vessel during sleep or through other trance-like states. But as soon as you pass away, depending upon your evolution, depending upon what kind of life you lived, will depend upon how much of your memory of past lives you will recover. It's not automatic. And I think there is a misconception that people believe that, oh, once I die, like boom, floodgates are going to open, Pandora's box of my thousands of lifetimes are all going to come flooding back. It's not exactly how it happens. And we learn in many of the André Louise series, again, in the book Action and Reaction, there's a case of two spirits that are trying to evolve in the spirit realm, and they get stuck. And they are sent to a special ministry where they receive a past life regression because they didn't remember this, but they go back, they regress back in the spirit realm, like probably 200-300 years or more, give or take, to a lifetime so distant and so far removed from who they were today. So that just goes to show you that these two particular spirits who they talk about, one small case in Action and Reaction, in order for them to progress forward in life, they needed to repair an error they had made like 500 years ago, that they had recalled a lot of different lifetimes, but they did not recall this particular lifetime. So it depends. And how much we remember, it depends. So I hope that answers your question. But always, you can read more about such things in the Spirits book by Allan Kardec, and any books of the codification, as well as the André Louise series by André Louise and Chico Xavier. I think we have one more question. How can I accept my trials and suffering? The pain seems blinding and overwhelming. How do I find love and acceptance in the chaos? That's the $1,000,000 question. And this is the question that the self-help industry has built billions of dollars on, for people trying to find hope, trying to find solace, trying to find understanding. And we're not saying that that's a bad thing. We're all searching. How do I accept my hardships when it feels really hard? We would say, firstly, with inside yourself, acknowledge how you feel, but also allow the possibility, allow the thought and remembrance that this too shall pass. It's not forever. And that life is trying to teach you something. So if I can change the way that I look at it, I can also change the way how I feel about it. We can get stuck in this mentality of just feeling the pain, because it can become so blinding and so painful. And in those moments, you reach out to the Creator. You pray as deeply as you can, as humbly as you can. And if you're at a point where you can't even pray for yourself, reach out to a friend, reach out to your local Spiritist center in your area. Or there are a lot of virtual sessions and virtual meetings and assistance now since the pandemic that's out there. And much like the story of Mr. Stafford, it's learning to accept with love and humility and understanding that this is not forever. It's just an experience. And that pain is a feeling that we, evolutionary wise, tend to want to run from. It's a protective mechanism. We don't just do it in a physical sense. When there's a fire, our hand retracts back. But we do the same thing emotionally. When we feel pain, we retract back. We become on guard. But now it's a relearning that needs to be had with our own emotions, our own feelings. When it comes to dealing with something painful, instead of pulling back and rejecting and being angry, leaning into it, allowing yourself to experience that, but also allowing yourself to experience the polarity of emotions that, okay, this might be sad. And indeed it is. And I'll miss my loved ones. But there's a lot to life still to be lived, and a lot of good still to be done while we still can. So softening is what can help us. Softening to our struggles and not rebelling. Always remembering that our lives do not end with the death of the physical body. And as painful as a situation may be, that pain does have an expiration date. It might not feel like it, but it does. So, dear friends, thank you so much for listening. We encourage you to listen in on the next session, session 17, on the next chapters that are coming up. Or if you haven't already, check out the previous lessons from the previous chapters from my fellow colleagues, brothers and sisters in the Spiritist arena. They're fantastic. They're on demand. You can watch them at your leisure, share with your friends. They're absolutely fantastic. And that is also a part of enriching your soul and your mind. Dear friends, thank you so much, and God bless us all. Bye-bye.